the right screen. Am I sharing the right screen? Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks so much for logging in today. I hope you find some things that are helpful here in the session about flipped teaching, and particularly with the building thinking classrooms. And if you're not familiar yet, I hate using acronyms when you don't know if everyone knows them yet, but that's building thinking classrooms. This was the title of an AMATYC presentation back in November, and you have to fit that title back into a small number of words, right? So that's why I use that abbreviation. But what I wanted to share today is a little bit about my experience with flipped teaching, why I do it, how I've done it in the past, and then how I have migrated over to using flipped teaching to go to do the building thinking classrooms way of active learning, because it's I was part of the Teaching for Prowess grant and found out as I was doing that work that there was a little bit of disconnect between flipped teaching and doing the building thinking classrooms in the way that Peter Lillijal does. So that's what this talk will be about. And you can find this everywhere, that learning science certainly supports the effectiveness of flipped teaching. And I wanted to share some steps, and I'm going to call it easy steps, on how anyone could start flipping if you wanted to use flipped teaching. But really, the first step to that is getting faculty on board with recognizing, well, why would I want to use flipped teaching? And also, I talking with different faculty over the course of years, find that we have some different definitions of what flipped teaching is, what active learning is. There was some discussion of that, the different definitions for active learning in some of yesterday's sessions. But I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm referring to as flipped and active learning. But the big idea here is remembering our purpose. The reason that most of us do any of the significant shifts that we have in how we teach is because we're trying to guide more students down that pathway of success, right? Not always just success in passing the class, and not always success in, oh, I loved this class, which that's great when students love it, especially right from the start, but not always the success. But I'm thinking of success as students learning the content in a way that they can apply it either in future courses, if it's a course that's building into another course, or use that content in their field of study, right? But if you are interested in guiding students towards really learning the content in your course, but looking for how to use your class time, every bit of research points to active learning. And really interestingly, during Carrie's her AI session yesterday, I did a search on active learning, like what, or not active learning, I'm sorry, engaged teaching. So asked the AI bot that, or the Gemini, about how can you best engage students in learning, and it was really interesting to me that the very top thing that came up, of course, was using active learning, so that students are doing more than just listening, right? I think most of us, if you're here really seeking out professional development, most of us are already on board with that. But there's the next step is there's a lot of research that lays out the best approach for using active learning. And for me, this Teaching for Prowess grant that AMATYC was so heavily supportive of and pushed forward, the biggest takeaway from that grant work for me was finally getting my hands on how to do the active learning in a way that was going to promote the highest level of student engagement, right? But just a quick reference of what am I referring to when I say flipped teaching. What you'd find if you did a search, if you looked up in any research articles What is flipped teaching? What they used to always say is a presentation of content occurs outside of class time, and the application of the content occurs through active and collaborative activity during class. Remembering that not all active learning is collaborative learning, but if we're going for the biggest bang for our buck, the best use of our class time, that active learning is also going to be collaborative learning. So here's a picture that I found several years back from UT Austin on their definition of what flipped teaching is. And you see, though, that the students are preparing for class activities before class and then coming to class and applying the concepts, and then they're checking their understanding after. And if you're familiar with building thinking classrooms, what you would find is that what building the big idea with the building thinking classrooms activity is that the time in class would be the first time that students are engaged with the content. So what I migrated to is what I'm calling a flipped flip, which allows students to develop those new ideas and develop their thinking and come up with their own way of thinking about some of the math concepts first in class. And then that out of class, what we see on this picture here, the before class, I just moved it over to after class. So the traditional flipped teaching, the presentation of content would occur before class, the application is after. The students have been introduced to the idea, so they're doing the application in class, but after they've had some introduction. But the flipped flip, saying that this discovery of content is happening during class, and then there's a recap of the key points of the content after class. And this right here, I'm talking to faculty member after faculty member, trying to bring more people on board with the building thinking classrooms way of doing things. Seems to be the biggest hang up is, well, I don't have time to cover all the content I need. Does anyone here say, oh yeah, that's why I have steered away from doing it 100%? How do you get through all the content? And I love Bob's always bringing up the conversation. Bob is always bringing up that conversation about how do we modernize the curriculum? Like, what do we change, overhaul the teaching of calculus, or we could talk about that with pre-calculus or any course, right? But if we're not in a place where our institution, and I'm in a place where my institution doesn't allow me to change the curriculum, we have the set of learning objectives we must cover. And if we don't cover them, then the student gets to their next course and they are often underprepared if they didn't get all the content right. So how do you use active learning day in and day out, 100% every class period, without doing some type of content development outside of class? And that's where this flipping the flip comes in. So during class, with a flipped flip, students are discovering some of the content, discovering their own way of understanding some of the concepts through that active and collaborative activity. And then after that, they go, oh, well, we hope that they go home. I know there's always the argument, but what if they don't do the homework? I'm going to get to that in a few slides here. But the best approach, if the student's doing what they're supposed to be doing, is that recap of key points from the content is delivered after class, either through videos, guided notes, or both. And also a checking of their understanding. So the homework is after they've started the learning process. I wanted to just give reference to a couple NSF grants, because my flipped teaching really went full speed ahead when I participated in this iFlip grant, the Innovative Flipped Teaching. And it was a partnership between a four-year university in our area and my community college, St. Louis Community College. And it focused on training, collaboration. So we were able to talk with other faculty in sciences and math. And it did provide a little bit of release time and tech support, which for me that tech support was the biggest piece. So I had been using active learning before I flipped, but always bumping into how do I keep doing this active learning and still get through the content until we get to the day where we can modernize the curriculum, right? And then if you're not familiar with the Teaching for Prowess grant, that concluded in spring 2025, and it was primarily the big focus of that grant was training faculty on how to implement the not flipped teaching, but how to implement the active learning. So if I wanted to share these, because I just want to put a plug in that if you ever see those opportunities, and AMATYC does a great job of sharing grant opportunities, but if you see those opportunities of how to jump in and participate in a grant, I'd encourage you to do what you can to apply for it. Often there's limited availability and not every application is accepted, but it's a great process to really get some additional training for the active learning or for flipping or for any of these different ways that we can improve our teaching. But before the Teaching for Prowess, what I was doing was before class, students completed guided notes by using the textbook and watching videos. And those videos I added as part of that iFlip grant. Before the iFlip grant, I was simply using guided notes from a textbook because I wanted to flip, but I just wasn't comfortable making videos yet. And I don't know if anyone here has thought about flipped teaching, but have an impression that you can't flip without videos. And I'm going to say that I flipped calculus and pre-calculus for several years before receiving any real training on it and before receiving any training on how to make some videos. And it was fully based on students opening their math textbook and doing some guided reading notes from that. And then at the start of class, there was a assessment, really short quiz that was really just encouraging those students to keep up with that before class reading. And then during class, they sat, there's a key word. If you're familiar with building thinking classrooms, you know that's before Teaching for Prowess, but they sat in groups of various sizes. Sometimes they picked their own groups. Sometimes I placed students in groups. Sometimes it was just based on where they were sitting, but they sat and did printed problem sets together. And it was great. It was certainly better than a lecture class. So I'm looking back on that saying that I don't think it was the very best way to do the active learning, but it was certainly better than a lecture format. And then after class, students completed a small set of practice problems that were similar to those group problems. So here's an activity sheet. I know the screen is really small, but I did share this activity sheet, and you'll see the key is that it says student page. I did share this in the Google folder that I shared. I hope you're able. Kelly was kind enough to do a test run before the session and said, yes, she was able to access those. But if you pulled that file up, you could see a closer version of this. But this is what the activity might have looked like. That was just an activity sheet that students picked up in class, printed on paper, and they sat with their group and worked through these together. And I would walk around the room and assist students, jumping from group to group to group, and also had an embedded tutor at that time. So the embedded tutor also went from group to group. And primarily that embedded tutor was a former student in the class who had already learned with the same activities and doing the same notes before class. Well, during Teaching for Prowess, I switched it around because what big premise of building thinking classrooms is that students' first engagement with the content is when they're thinking through the content themselves. So I stopped encouraging the notes and the videos before class. And we just started class right off the bat with students working in random groups on non permanent vertical spaces, so whiteboards on the classroom walls. Or if your school doesn't promote a lot of whiteboards, then whiteboards that we rolled in from other spaces. I've now even gotten some cling paper that I tear off and cling to the wall so that the walls are circled with non-permanent vertical writing spaces. And so the very first time that students see the content now is that they're working in random groups on those whiteboards, learning the concept and practicing them, or during the teaching for prowess. And then after class, I gave students two assignments. There was the guided notes that, again, they were built on reading the textbook and watching a video. And the second part of the after class assignment was completing a few problems for practice. So that's how I flipped during teaching for prowess. And at the time, and I'd say it close to the end of the teaching for prowess work, when I had been doing this for several years, I migrated over to another way of doing this. It's really close, but I just tweaked it slightly. So how I currently teach in a flipped format is that I give students some choice. I make those guided notes available ahead of time. The videos are posted ahead of time. Some students are going to access the notes and the videos and the textbook before the activity, and others are going to do it after the activity. But it's not required. It's not required until sometime after the activity. So that's what I mean by flipping the flip. But I also wanted to be really clear about what a flipped class is also. But at the start of class, students are still working nearly the entire class session in random groups at non-permanent vertical writing spaces to learn those concepts and practice them. It's just that some students might have gotten a little bit of information about the content ahead of time. I saw that a comment just came up about, do I still use the textbook provided guided notes? I don't use textbook provided guided notes. I tried it for a couple of classes, but then found it just didn't cover the same material I wanted to cover. I could show you a copy if we have time at the end or during break later. I'd be happy to share some of my guided notes. But as a department, different teachers teaching some of the classes developed and edit some guided notes that we use, that several of us use. But we created them based on the textbook and based on some videos, but not the ones that were provided by the publisher. And then now what happens is after class, students complete a small set of practice problems similar to the group problems. And either at the end of class or at the start of the next class. So we've done the activity from section 4.1, whatever that is, on Monday. Then on Wednesday, the next class session, we already have a short quiz on it. And though I typically before flipping wouldn't have given a quiz that very next class period, I'm giving that quiz because it's primarily based on those guided notes. And they're usually open note assessments. So if you've completed those guided notes, you have them right here in front of you, and you're filling out this quiz, this assessment. So really it's assessing, did the student do that out of class assignment? Here's an activity that I use on exponential functions. So you'll see that part one, and again, I know it's really small on some screens. If you wanted to pull this up from the folder, you could see it a little bit bigger, but I'll read some of it also. I know that this is pre-calculus, but I always start with this question of of expanding an exponential expression that has a negative in it, right? So we've got the opposite of 2 squared, and then the opposite parenthesis, 2 squared, close parenthesis. And then what happens if we put the whole thing in parentheses? So parenthesis -2 squared. And what happens if we put the square outside? And then I throw in that last one is what happens when the exponent is the opposite of 2, and asking students to expand those and evaluate it. And I'm amazed. I do this even in calculus and still find misconceptions between how different students are evaluating expression with an exponent when there's a negative in there, right? But that that part is maybe the first step of what students are doing at the board. And by the way, what the students see on the projector isn't the sheet that you see here. What I do now is these questions are on a PowerPoint, so that way I can click it to the next one, preventing those divide and conquer groups. Do you have, if you've used active and collaborative learning where you've got students working together in a group, maybe you've had that where students will say, oh, you do number 1 and I'll do number 2. And the idea is that they're collaborating and thinking through each example together. It's not about finishing all the examples, but about getting as much engagement and thinking as we can get, right? So I put these on PowerPoint now, but it's just, I just copied the problems from this sheet directly on there. So someone asked, do I find it helpful for students to write on their own paper instead of giving space on the worksheet itself? So I'm not using that worksheet at all anymore. I'm not using the worksheet at all because they're seeing the problem project up on the screen and they're at a whiteboard doing the problem themselves. But at the time that I did use this as a student sheet that they were doing as a SAT, I did always encourage them to do the work on their own paper, not trying to squeeze it into that page. But thanks for those questions. So I don't know if anyone has already started flipping or if you're interested in starting flipping, or maybe trying to understand whether it's something you could do. I'd say especially preparing for the fall, everyone here could be flipping if you wanted to by then. But even in a November conference, I would say, oh, you could do this next week. You don't have to have this long period of preparation. If you're wanting to try flipped teaching for even just one class session, so I would say if you're wanting to start flipping, choose a class session to flip and then I recommend starting with that in-class assignment because that's the meat and potato of what you want students to be thinking about. So start with that in-class assignment that's going to introduce students to a new concept and guide them to think. And I find this to be the most challenging part of the process now. Used to be really easy to just create problem sets. I'd go to the homework management system, gather some homework problems from there, and put them on a sheet, right? Or go to an old textbook or a publisher worksheet, something. It's easy enough to find problem sets. But coming up with some really thoughtful questions that push students to think and to truly understand the concept, that for me is the biggest challenge. What you would do next is create an out of class assignment that allows students to review those main ideas. So this is for those of us who are teaching at an institution where we must get through this long list of objectives, right? If you're worried about using active learning during class because you can't get through all the objectives, I'll say that creating this out of class assignment, like the guided notes that allows students to review those main ideas, is crucial. And that's how we can get through all the content that we need to. And then that check your understanding, or what we used to call a homework assignment, right? The practice problems that students are doing on their own. Um, so I'll see if there are any questions, but then if I built this presentation so that it could cover as much material as necessary, or as I could rather, I mean, and using up all the time. So I put in some pieces here about some challenges to overcome, because if you have tried flipping, I'm sure you've come up with some challenges. And I am going to cut to the chase with some of those. If you were looking for 5 reasons I'm not going to flip, then probably at least one of those is going to be here. But rather than going from that point of view of why not to do it, I'm saying no. So here's a challenge that you can overcome. And here's a big one. Students might, well, just get rid of the might, because they will. Students will complain, and some students will drop the class immediately. That's happened even before I flipped. When I was using active learning as a primary use of class time, on the very first day of class, a student went right to registration after class and dropped the class. And they tried to talk him out of it. The tutors tried to talk him out of it. The registration staff members try to talk him out of it, say, no, just give the class a little bit of give it more time. I'm sure you'd do well with this. But yeah, some students are gonna drop the class without any consideration of whether it's going to be the best way for them to learn or not. And students will complain. They'll complain to you, sometimes to a department chair or others. But how to work against that. So some tips for that is right off the bat, I've learned over the years of using active learning, and even more so using the flipped teaching, is from day one, putting in front of students the why and the how conversations, explaining why we do the flip the way we do, and how we're going to do it, and how this improves student learning. And I listen and listen in the classroom as we're doing those activities. And when I hear a student say something positive about it, I'll say, "Oh, I just heard someone say, what was that you just said about this?" And the student will say, "Oh, I was just telling my group that I've never understood math so well." And I hear that a lot in my flipped classes when they're at the board. They'll say, "Oh, I've never understood math like I do now." And even students in the hallway, some of my colleagues who've been using flipped teaching through building thinking classrooms have found those positive comments in the hallways and conversations about why it's more fun going to class now. But bringing those conversations to light, like class session after class session, not just at the start of class. Another way that I have worked against some of the student complaints is frequent cats. So not these cats, but the classroom assessment techniques. And that's where a student can anonymously write out some responses to some ideas about what's going well for you, what would you like to see different. And it gives me opportunity to close the loop in that assessment and go back to students and say, "Oh, I've heard students reporting this. Let's talk about that." So talking through that where they know that they're being heard, but then continuously reminding students that it's research points in every direction, coming from every direction, research points that this is the best way to learn. And the other way that I help get students on board is connecting with them before class, during class, after class, just sharing positive feedback with them, talking with them about their experience, and helping them again feel like they're being heard. Another challenge is I've never made videos for students and I don't know where to start. I flipped my classes well before I was making videos. And then I started making some videos and they were terrible. But I've come up with some ways of making some videos that aren't that terrible and that are really pretty easy to make. But if you're holding back from flipping because you feel like you have to have the videos, some ideas I'd share is some screencast videos. That is the best I have found that this for me, this is the best way to give that content. And I'm using a device that allows me to write on it. I write with the special stylist and you don't see my hand. It's more like a Khan Academy where you just see the writing appear, right? And you hear my voice explaining the math, but the video is just showing the math being written, right? So screencast, and that's a very, very easy way to make videos. I know that they say the best approach is when we're using students learn best and engage the most when we're using the videos that we created. But some of our publishers do have some decent videos. And if you're holding yourself up from flipping because you aren't ready to make videos, even starting with those publisher videos is a good starting point. Reading assignments is way underrated because reading assignments, we're pushing students to learn a skill that's going to get them through those upper level science and math classes, right? So giving students an assignment to read the textbook, but guided notes, I have found that those guided notes are absolutely crucial. And that's where we've got some deliverable that students can complete and pass out. So if you're concerned about the making videos, there are a lot of other ways to approach those out of class assignments. Another challenge is students don't do homework, so how will they succeed without a lecture? Here's what I say about that. If we don't use flipped teaching because we're concerned about those students who don't do what they're supposed to. We're allowing those inactive students to dictate the direction of the course. They're often the most vocal students, those students who haven't done the out of class assignments, but they're typically the student who wouldn't have done a homework assignment anyhow. But really, there is no excuse, no good excuse for skipping a video or reading assignment, right? Traditional homework, they could say, oh, I didn't understand, or it was too difficult. I didn't have access to a tutor. But if the primary part of the homework is watching that video and completing guided notes, everyone can do it if they make a choice to make the time. I love this meme. You didn't, and I show this to students often. I can't wait to hear your excuse why you didn't watch the video. And yeah, maybe it's, oh, my internet went down, or I didn't have, a lot of times they'll just say, oh, I didn't have time. And same reasons they didn't do the homework, right? But watching those videos or doing those out of class assignments are time consuming assignments, but they're easy assignments, meaning anyone can do it, right? Another thing is I learned that when I lightened the check your understanding assignments, the after class homework, where a student in a traditional class maybe had more practice problems to do, now I'm freeing up their time to get those videos and those guided notes done and reading the textbook, that freeing up the class time, or they're out of class time so that they can really dedicate the time to doing that. So making the practice problems a smaller set. And then requiring those gradables, I don't know if that's a real word, but requiring something that's delivered, such as guided notes or concept check quizzes, has really helped pull students along because we all have learned that even in calculus and above, most of the students aren't going to do it if it's optional, right? Or if there's not some assessment of it. Another big one is that and this is hard for me, but I push myself not to repeat that video and reading content. I don't, and I'm going to call it's a waste of time. I don't waste time doing that. Now, I do with some of the really significant concepts that are more challenging. I'll address those in class, but oh, pull out your guided notes and let's talk a little bit more about this example. What questions did you have about that example? Or, I mean, we're talking about some of that work when it's a really significant concept that I know everything hinges on, right? Another question or reason that some some faculty don't start flipping is this idea that active learning is a lot of work and doesn't make a significant difference in student learning. And again, I wanted to share some of those ideas. That collaborative learning is listed as one of the high impact practices for HIP. It's the new HIP name for it, right? A high impact practice. Collaborative learning is listed on this short list of HIPs. Multiple studies have demonstrated the effectiveness of active learning, and effectiveness meaning students actually learning. I don't know if anyone here is a guided pathways institution. If you're not yet, you probably will be soon. This seems to be one of those things that the League for Innovation and Community College and most administrators and community college boards are jumping into. But the guided pathways model has 5 pillars, and some of them are like helping students get on a pathway towards completing a degree and so on. But one of those 5 columns is to ensure learning. And so this so easily slides right into many institutions' primary goals, because we can demonstrate that the active learning is one of the best ways to ensure students are learning. And then here's another one, is that it doesn't promote student success. So I wanted to share some information about student success. It does allow for multiple learning styles. When you have some students who say, I learn best when I'm writing, well, they're spending most of their class time writing on the board. Or I learn best when I'm watching examples. They're seeing examples on the board the entire class period, and so on. So all of the learning styles are addressed, and learning needs of students with multiple levels of ability and multiple levels of prior knowledge. When that group making is done the way that Building Thinking Classrooms talks about, with a random group, then they're in groups with students of multiple abilities with the math, and everyone's success seems to come up. I'm going to add that I had a student, first time in my career of teaching, several decades, that I had a student who was completely deaf in my class this last semester, using flipped teaching and Building Thinking Classrooms way of active learning. And that student did phenomenally well. It was and that student often made comments about how much easier it was for them to learn the content in this format. I loved how that student jumped from group to group, because each class period, students would be in a different group, and all of the students in the class just embraced the student. And the student came with 2 interpreters provided by the institution. So that group, instead of having three, we had 3 participants and then 2 additional people in the group who were interpreters. But certainly prevents cognitive overload. And what I'm talking about is, if you're sitting in a lecture, then pretty soon you get to the point where I just can't take any more in, right? But as students are at the board actively engaging, they're not getting to that point. And then of course the retention of the content. Looks like we do still have a few minutes. So I didn't know if we wanted to talk a little bit more about what the Building Thinking Classrooms looks like. I didn't think about using the chat to ask for feedback on how familiar everyone is with that. But I'll just swing through these really quickly here. That if you're looking for flipping your class and want to make sure that that class time itself, the active learning experience, is the very best that it can be. What I love about this work, this Building Thinking Classrooms work, is that Dr. Peter Lillijal has done this research that finally points us to, here's the silver bullet in active learning. If you're going to do it like this. We don't have to think through, oh, I'm going to try doing the groups this way and see what works best. But he's found through research that these non-permanent vertical writing spaces are what creates the highest level of engagement. So students are active and on their feet the entire time. Now, in my classroom, we still have chairs and desks, but students aren't sitting at them. And they'll often pull a chair over to their whiteboard. And I try to discourage that because part of this research is that the physiological staying more alert because we're standing. So we do take breaks in the longer classes, but these students standing at a board for most of the class time. And then they're visibly random groups of three. So when you're dividing students up into groups, I do it with name cards where I shuffle them, or I do it electronically. I'd be happy to talk more if anyone isn't familiar with the different ways of making the groups, even as easy as passing everyone out a standard, using a standard deck of cards and passing cards out, and all the threes are together or all the fours are together and so on. But having the groups be visibly random, it's beneficial because every student is now an active, more likely to be an active participant, simply because they haven't been able to get comfortable in that group with the idea that, oh, I know that someone, Chris is here. Chris is going to be the leader of our group because I know he's the best calculus student, or so on, right? But everyone's more engaged when those groups are random. And then there's more, we're looking for more thinking and less mimicking. I have some of my activity built around students practicing a skill, but I work towards making the majority of the activity a thinking activity. Uh, and then, oh, I'm getting a last thing here with these out of class activities. And let me jump to the end. And these slides are available. Looks like we're just about out of time here. So one of the sample activities here, and I'm going to leave those for you to view if you're interested in them, and I'd be happy to talk more about them. But we talk about any of the, if, oh, let me go back to there. If you wanted to talk more about any of those activities, be happy to. But I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So if there are any questions, and also I wanted to mention that next Wednesday, there's going to be AMATYC is sponsoring roundtable discussion, a virtual roundtable discussion. I don't know if I think someone here is going to talk more about it, but it's at 12 o'clock Eastern, 9 o'clock Pacific. And what the intention of this session was AMATYC wanted to provide a place for more discussion on this topic. So I don't know if anyone had more information about it, but are there any questions that anyone wanted to? Oh, I see a couple have popped up here. Oh, Kelly shared that she uses some giant playing cards, and oh yeah, they keep disappearing. Yeah, I find students like to I use Valentine cards when they go on sale after Valentine's Day. You get the whole box for 25 cents, and I laminate them. Kind of a fun, childish way of getting the groups. But yeah, sometimes they disappear. Oh, it's neat to hear that KMATIC is doing a building thinking classroom book study this summer. Uh, and so C. White is open to answering some more questions about that. That's great to hear. And if there were any other questions or comments, or so it looks like we have 7 minutes, but want to leave time for the next presentation to get up and going. So Kelly, do you have more information about the Wednesday? I know